All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Will Yandik. I'm a fourth-generation farmer in Livingston in Columbia County. My background is in ecology and environmental science, but I was asked to come here today to tie some of these themes together and give you some of the perspectives that I've learned from other farmers. In addition to being a practicing farmer, I'm the vice president of the Columbia County Farm Bureau, trustee of the Columbia Land Conservancy, and I interact with a lot of different farmers from very different walks of life, and I've tried to compile some of their impressions into this presentation. So I wanted to just start with this comparison of aerial photographs that Conrad helped prepare for me as a lay citizen several years ago. This is the north parcel of my own farm in Livingston. And I just wanted to compare these two images and see if there are any major differences that I can point out that the audience notices here. So the image on the left is 1942, and the image on the right, 2017. What are some of the differences that we see here? So obviously the right is green, so chlorophyll evolved sometime after 1942. Yeah, I mean, this is a model for the kinds of changes that are happening throughout the Northeast. In the 40s, this is about maybe 5 years after my grandfather sent the horses to the glue factory and started to mechanize. And it was part of this old German, Eastern European cultural idea, more than economic, that if you had a farm and you were a real farmer, you were going to use every darn square inch of that place. So on this farm, places back here where it was extremely wet marginal land, they were still pulling seasonal hay off of it. You can see that most of the land was an orchard. There's some grapes down here. And you have some pasture land to the east back at the time where a farm in Columbia County could make money on 20 cows, back when virtually all farms had a seasonal dairy. And the image on the right is the care of the farm under myself and my brother, and you can see a lot of rewilding. A lot of economic factors have led to this. My farm, about 200 acres and its 3 parcels, is a mid-sized farm, and we're the most endangered class of farming throughout the Northeast. The farms that persist, a handful of them are getting larger to employ efficiencies and economy of scale. The other majority of farms in the Northeast are getting much smaller, and my farm is a member of that category, where we see less total area of farming surrounded by a rewilding landscape of successional forests, second growth woods. And I think that's an opportunity and a context for us to look at when we think about what farming is going to be in the Hudson Valley over the next 50 years. If you're a forest ecologist, you might look at an image like this and see a fragmented landscape. But if you're a farmer that's interested in ecosystem services and pollination and thinking about a farm as not just a means to provide a living for my son, the 5th generation, but an opportunity to provide habitat as well, there is an opportunity to farm in this context where not every square inch of that farm is in production anymore. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about to tie this together is to make an argument why I think we're at a unique and fertile moment in our agricultural history in this region in terms of providing new opportunities for ecological farming in this area. And the second half of my talk, I'll talk about some of the pitfalls and challenges that we still have to get over if we're going to make sure that some of the many great ecological ideas and pieces of research that we've heard with the previous talks today actually get implemented, right? It's one thing to do this work, but if it simply dies in some spiral-bound binder in a library or in some specialized office, then we're not really realizing the full potential of this work. So the first thing that we can talk about when we think about farming in the Northeast in the next half century is who is going to be doing that farming. We're on the eve of a historic transition of retirement for the current suite of farmers. The average Hudson Valley farmer is 60 years old, and the people that are going to replace them are very much an open question. We could either gnash our teeth and worry about the fact that our farming population is aging out, or we can choose to see some of the bright spots in that, which is that with a new suite and generation of farmer comes a new opportunity to do things differently and think differently. So only for the second time in the last 100 years, in each decadal census of farming and farmers, do we see farmers under the age of 35 increasing within the last 10 years. Only the second time in the great story of the decline of farming through the 20th century. We know, because of this work that's been done by the National Young Farmers Coalition, of which I'm a member of their development staff, that many of these farmers under the age of 35 have never farmed before. They're not third and fourth generation farmers like myself. They're brand new farmers. And so there's a tremendous opportunity just to rethink the way that we farm if you're starting from scratch. They're majority female, and they're fairly progressive, measured by baseline political measures, things like believing in climate change, believing in kinds of in the kinds of ecological farming that we've talked about throughout the presentations today. And there are new market opportunities. Increasingly, consumers who are polled are interested in buying food and food products that come from more environmentally sustainable methods. The demand for organic is growing by double digits, which is an easy thing to do when you're starting in the basement, right? If you've got $2 in your bank account and you've doubled it to $4 the next year, that's an impressive percentage change, but it's $4. So despite that cheekiness, there is a real and serious interest in organic and sustainably produced foods. And there are all kinds of ecological labels to cue to consumers that the products that they buy are connected to some serious ecology. Like you can put a bobolink on a beer can. It's pretty cool. There are a slowly evolving set of policies that are happening at the federal, state, and local level that are going to make the kinds of sustainable and ecological farming that we've talked about today more possible. The 2018 Farm Bill was just reauthorized. Does anybody know what 75% of the Farm Bill's appropriations go to? It's a big bill. It's over 500 pages, $900 billion in appropriations. What does 75% of that money go to? Food stamps, supplemental nutrition, and of the remaining 25% of the US Farm Bill, about 70 or 80% of that goes to direct crop subsidies, mostly corn and soy. So even though it's the rounding error in the budget, a rounding error, folks like the National Young Farmers Coalition, National Farmers Unions have worked very hard to increase funding within that bill for things like organic certification, for improving local access to markets. So we're getting there. We're inching there at a federal level to put our money where our mouth is and start to support the kinds of things that are going to help us transition to a new generation of farming. One of the most successful programs has been something called the Conservation Reserve Program. Very simple idea. We pay farmers not to farm lands that have ecological value. And you know what? It works. The most dyed-in-the-wool Republican Trump-supporting farmers in states like Minnesota and Colorado have waiting lists for these programs, and they work. The scientists that study Conservation Reserve Program lands have shown positive feedback and positive results for increased biodiversity. It's not a program that we hear very much of east of the Mississippi, and it should be. There's absolutely no reason why this program, which has largely been taken advantage of by Western farmers, can't be used in places like the Hudson Valley to take marginal lands and lands that are not being used for active crop production and to use them for carbon mitigation and habitat opportunities. Here in New York State, we have leaders like just north of here, our local Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett, 2 years ago had something called a carbon farming bill to try to encourage farmers to use cover cropping and other methodologies to improve the carbon benefits and soil benefits of those properties. There's absolutely no reason why those pieces of legislation and ideas can't be coupled with habitat preservation as well. And of course, we have some workhorses at the local level. There's a tremendous number of people that continue to farm, even though it isn't economically critical for their income levels, because of the tax benefits that agricultural assessments bring them. This isn't particularly true whether you're a 10th generation farmer or a new land owner that's an investment banker and bought a 40-acre-old dairy farm. Those ag exemptions, in many ways, are staving off development. And I can't see why, if we can't partner with these individuals with the latest ecological data, we can't start to think about ways to farm those parcels in new and better ways. And of course, the pipe dream for many in the land trust community is to create direct subsidies from local taxes for conservation measures. And there are a few bright spots here in the Hudson Valley where some of the more progressive communities are making inroads on that. So those are some of the great opportunities. I mean, the Hudson Valley and the Northeast in general, I think, is just this exciting laboratory where there is an intersection between educated researchers, landowners that are progressive enough to be interested in these issues, and the great prize of all, which is the 20 million mouths that are, an hour and a half south of us in the New York metro area that are progressive and interested in these products. Some of the challenges, cultural inertia, some communication strategies that we'll talk about, economic limitations that prevent the full use of some of the good ecological practices that we know work. Equipment and supplies is self-evident. I can't tell you how many small, old family farms here throughout the Northeast are farming with 50 and 100-year-old equipment. And there's nothing sexy about that. They're not doing like that out of some sort of back to the land. It's because equipment is incredibly expensive. A simple 2-corn row seeder, a no-till seeder, can easily run $30,000 or $40,000. That's a lot of arugula that you've got to sell at the local farmer's market to make some of that back. So if we're going to be making management suggestions for ecological aims like no-till, or seeding certain prairie mixes or wildflower mixes, we have to be sure that the farming community has access to that equipment, because we can't assume that they do. There are some members of the National Young Farmers Coalition and others that are looking at more cooperative measures to share equipment. The limitation is that when you plant, everybody kind of needs it all at the same time, so there are some issues with that. But we're going to need some new models to make sure that some of the specialized equipment that's necessary can be used. Some cultural inertial issues, right? So I'm guilty of this myself. I've been a lifelong birder. My background is in ecology. And I go out and I see cedar waxwings eating our cherries. I don't have good things to say about birds at that particular moment. And I think the challenge is for those of us in the ecological environment is to help farmers and landowners see that there's an awful lot that's happening that isn't as visible, that's really critical for their farm. It's the deer that's eating your freshly planted apple orchard, or the birds eating your cherries, or the many insect pests that attack your crops that you instantly see. It's the less visible things that I think that are part of the picture. And I wanted to compliment John Bowermaster for some of the images. One of the most arresting images of the film that he showed were those flies on the tassel of corn. I don't buy for a second that we've got to tell every ecological story with these charismatic macro fauna. I don't buy that for a second, that the average American public isn't going to be just as interested in the insects and turtles and fungi. I think the filming techniques and the narrative stories have to keep pace with that. And I think farmers are no less. Farmers live within the world of soil and managing that soil. And so, if we want people to care about wildlife, don't be afraid to tell those stories about the things that don't have giant horns or bright colors. For somebody that is once affiliated with a university and is no longer, I can tell you how frustrating it is to deal with all of the paywalls that are erected around some of the top publication of science journals. Even individuals that are model citizens that want to learn more about ecology and to tailor those results to their own individual parcels find it incredibly difficult. And so it's such a challenge for those of us in this room that are non-specialists as well as the specialists working in university structures to think, am I really contributing my full research to my community and my nation if everything that I've worked for over the past 3 years is condensed into one paragraph on management recommendations buried at the back of the discussion section of my peer-reviewed paper? And we can do better than that, right? We're going to need some help moving that information from the scientists to the public, but I would love to see a future in which peer-reviewed scientists are still doing that work. I mean, the peer-reviewed journal is a workhorse of communicating science to other scientists, but it's not doing its full value in terms of communicating that science to the public. And so when we talk to the public, we don't have to talk down to farmers. Farmers have their own very broad area of specialized language and research as any other professional group does. But I think we have to be careful of those buzzwords that are professionally linked to the science community, right? And when we make recommendations, to understand that farmers are operating in a specialized environment, just as specialized as the research itself. So when we make recommendations to vegetable growers, well, what kind of vegetable growers? Because A farmer that grows tomatoes has a very different set of soil requirements, pest regimes, beneficials that they're seeking to attract than someone growing melons. So when we see often filtered through things like cooperative extensions, very broad recommendations about pollinators, I challenge this group, which does have, Claudia and Conrad have very detailed information that they presented on which particular species of insects are better at pollinating which groups, to try to do our best to communicate those specifics to the best of our ability. And if we don't know the answer, we should be honest about that. Noah gave a very detailed talk about mowing and his innovative strategies to actually find ways to mow early and to provide a safe haven between the next mowing period. But for the last quarter century, folks like Mass Audubon were doing the hard work of trying to tell farmers, hey, you have to mow after August 1st, which is just a non-starter for a dairy farmer that is already operating on razor-thin margins and needs that high-protein early hay. So we have to make sure that our recommendations understand the system of a farm. And that's what ecologists are brilliant at. Ecologists are master analyzers of systems. That's what they do. And so to take that extra step and understand the system of a farmer and what their specific needs are going to go a long way to making sure that those management recommendations are actually used. The economics, as you can tell from your broad understanding of farming and virtually any article that you read about farming, it's a tough business. Margins are incredibly thin, right? I can't think of very many other professions where we've taken a historically subsistence life. For generations, farmers you won if you didn't starve at the end of the winter. That's what you win the game of life as a farmer if you have managed to raise another generation. And then to take farming into the modern economy with its globalized pressures, it's a thin margin business. So we have to keep that in mind when we make management recommendations to farmers. What are some of the things that I'm optimistic that we can ask of farmers? That their land use becomes less intensive when the land is available. So again, it gets back to that title slide of my own farm. My farm makes more money on 6 acres of apples now than my grandfather did with 60 acres. And so that enables me to make very different land use decisions because I'm able to channel our products that are high quality and sustainably labeled in a retail environment rather than my grandfather's game where instead of being a price maker in a retail environment, he was a price taker. Longer rotations. It's interesting for me to hear the multiple number of talks today talk about the potential benefits of fallow periods. But that rings true to a farmer. There is nothing easier than to tell a farmer, do nothing with that land. The likelihood of adoption with that recommendation is quite high. When we can allow marginal lands to revert back to naturalized or native wildness, let's try to do that. And adopting cover crops and pasture mixes that foster greater diversity. A little bit more on that in a minute. So one of the things I'd also like to challenge this group is to think, both even the consumers, those of you who might not even own a large parcel of land, is to think carefully about what we mean by intensive farming. I think the historic use of that word has been to distinguish that type of farming, intensive farming, from organic. So in this context, in the historical context of this word, I think when many people talked about intensive farming, they meant a high chemical input. Lots of sprays, lots of herbicides and pesticides. But one of the things I'd like to highlight in this picture, this is in a certified organic farm. That tractor is doing something called rolling and crimping, roller crimping. So there's an attachment on the back of the tractor. A crop of rye, in this case, is grown. Rye gets to about flowering stage, and then the farmer actually rolls the rye over so that it makes a kind of thatch or straw or mulch that a no-till seeder can then go in between. It's meant to replace tillage, so it's a very successful no-till method. But in farming, as an ecology, the great question is scale. So even though this might be a certified organic farm, it sends a signal to the consumer. This is a good low-intensity farm by the traditional definition. It doesn't look like there's a lot of room in that picture for much of anything in terms of biodiversity. This, on the other hand, is in Columbia County and is a conventional farm. This is a spaghetti squash crop. This land was plowed and tilled just as they've done for 100 years. There was no pesticides applied, but a pre-emergent herbicide. But it's within a matrix and a context in which the shale outcrop behind it has been mowed once every other 2 years. And it challenges us to think, is this the kind of farm that we can maybe push in a different direction to use maybe fewer pesticides, maybe a better tillage environment, but within a matrix of very interesting and intact habitats for wildlife preservation. It's a lower intensity use of the farm, even though its traditional classification is non-organic. And one of the things I'm interested at the Hub is to think about that, the sweet spot for a farmer, which is the non-growing season. What can farmers do during the majority of the year where they're not in their fields? They're not plowing, they're not running tractors over it. This is a cover crop of rye, and rye is king in the Hudson Valley for a very simple reason. It's cheap. It's extremely cheap. It's probably what most of the farmers, organic or non-organic in Columbia County, use as a winter cover crop. And it's interesting to me to think, are there other cover crop arrangements, seed mixes that farmers could be using that are comparable in price, do good things for the soil, and possibly even left into a fallow rotation can provide a wildlife habitat? So the big question is, who is going to do this critical work of connecting science and scientists to the people that are going to apply this work? I think it would be true to say 20, 30 years ago, if a serious scientist was doing anything other than peer-reviewed research, at best it could be neutral to their career, and in the very worst cases, it could tank their career. And so one of the things I'm advocating and arguing is to create a new culture, and it's been exemplified by each of the talks that we've heard here today, where practicing scientists are not only not penalized for reaching out to non-specialized scientists to describe their work, but are encouraged, funded, and supported to do that work. Because as much as I believe that there is a new generation of farmer, a new type of farmer that's receptive to these types of farming, the reality is that farming is always going to be what it is, a very high intensive use of time. And if our community, those of us who are trained in ecology or practicing ecologists, if we're not doing the ones that are reaching out, it's very unlikely that the farmers are going to reach in. And so what are the things that we can do in summary? We can package the best information. We can be honest about the things that we know and we don't know. We can reach out to those communities, like Noah's work in Vermont. And I'm tremendously hopeful about that. A dairy farmer friend of mine the other day actually did the depressing work of figuring out what their hourly income was for the work that they did over the previous year, and it came to 17 cents per hour, okay? So if you think that farmers are just these free market rational robots that respond to profit motive and no other values, then explain to me why this dairy farmer does what they do. So farmers are steeped in values, deeply steeped in values, because if all they cared about was the profit motive, believe me, they would not be doing what they're doing. I find that most of the farmers, conventional and organic alike, care very deeply about the land, have very deep values about that land, and are very receptive to many of the ideas that we talked about today if you use the right language. And so, the common land that makes up this community is literally and figuratively the common ground that we seek. Thank you for allowing me to lend my perspective. I'm deeply optimistic, and as somebody that has sat through a lot of ecology conferences, to sit through today's talks where there was clearly many of these items outlined, presentations that were easily digestible, that talked about real farmers and real constraints that farmers face in a way that's accessible for consumers, farmers, landowners, and researchers alike, gives me hope. I know we have some serious challenges. I'm not a Pollyanna about it, climate change being not the least among them, but I have reason to believe that if my son, the 5th generation of my farm, continues to go on with the family business, that he will be doing things in a far more sustainable method, in a sustainable context, instead of being the hippie outlier like the farmers that farmed this way 50 years ago, will be a part of a larger community supported by those of us who eat 3 square meals a day. That's where we've got to get. That's why I'm happy to be speaking here today and to be part of this community. And thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks. If there are any questions, I can.
Is this on? Yes. Thank you for that. I am one of the scientists that needs to speak to farmers. Where do I do that in New York?
That's a good question. So one of the frustrating things at the Farm Bureau, we go and lobby our state assembly members and state senators, and we're constantly fighting to keep Cornell's cooperative extension program at least funded at equal level. So the cooperative extensions have been the traditional model. If you want my humble opinion, I think they're going to need some help in any funding scenario. So who are those people? We have nonprofits like the Farm Hub, where that's an explicit part of their mission, and they have their own funding, non-taxpayer revenue streams as well that can help. I think we're in this region, I think we're going to really need to lean on our land trusts. I'm also a trustee of the Columbia Land Conservancy. I know this is true of many of the other land trusts in the area. They are succeeding in getting grants to do some of the supporting work that cooperative extensions have been doing for a century or more. But it takes all of us, right? It's going to take consumers supporting. I mean, one of the things, we talked about the great market opportunities for ecologically labeled things, but we didn't talk about what happens when Nabisco sees that there's double-digit growth in this and creates a whole new wave of greenwash on labeling that just is not connected to good ecological principles. So good quality consumers talking to other quality consumers. I don't think this is something that we can foist on any one particular group. I think it's going to take a cultural change from the university structure. The land trusts are going to have to step up. We need to fund our cooperative extensions more. And those of us who eat 3 square meals a day and care about how our food is raised are going to have to speak up too and vote a certain way.
I'm a big fan of scientists publishing their results both in technical and non-technical venues, and I've always done that. But apart from that, if you know how, you can get 99% of scientific articles from peer-reviewed journals for free. And the two easiest ways to do that are through your local library's interlibrary loan service, which is free for your annual library card. The other, not so well known, is if you can find the corresponding author's email address, which is either right on the abstract of the article, or you can look it up on a university website or somewhere else. You email and ask for an electronic copy of a paper, and we want people to read our papers, so most scientists are quite happy to send out PDFs. And there's no reason why anyone in the world should pay a for-profit publisher $30 or $40 for an article. That's the greediest way of doing business that I can imagine.
Those are two great pieces of advice, and the interlibrary loan system is how I've done it. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Not really a question, but thank you very much for your very succinct and coherent presentation on the challenges and opportunities. I'm also in academia, and the research issue is an astounding one. Granted, many professional publications are rather indecipherable to anybody but an expert in that field, but even most scholarly papers have abstracts and introduction sections and conclusions which are very digestible. The big challenge, as is being mentioned here, is that that material is no longer easily accessible to the public. There was a time when almost every researcher would have his or her papers posted on their personal university website, and more that is no longer the case. So we need some sort of public outcry about this, because it's just in the last few years where the access to professional publications has gotten to be more and more restricted. And many of these researchers are under federal and state grants, and the money that they're using to generate that research is coming from our pockets.
That's an excellent point.
Any last questions? Are you seeing with the younger farmers any difference in how they want to receive information? At in our work, we're always being told, or I'm always being told by the younger people, like, it's too long, it's too much reading. Nobody wants to read anymore. So I know that the scientific journals and the papers are like, that's the body of work and that's where the information is, but do we need to, you know, and I'm always understanding too that farmers like to see things like for themselves, right, in real time. So just wondering if there's any thinking around how to get information to people in the form that is the most useful to them.
That's a great question. My own personal experience validates that farmers are social learners the way every other professional group is a social learner. So places like the Hub that have a program where farmers gather together and can see real-world applications is a huge leap forward. I try to think through what we would do on our farm if I had a particular problem with peach leaf curl on a peach tree. The first thing I'd do is pick up the phone and talk to other farmers, and then I'd probably look online second. So I'm not arguing that scientists solely on their shoulders have the obligation to make sure there is a section within their peer-reviewed work, which again is essential. The peer-reviewed paper serves a purpose. It's to present the basics of research that in a defensible form that other specialists can look at and learn from. What I am arguing is that it's just insufficient and not an endpoint. And so there are probably multiple strategies that will get us to where we need to get to. Traditionally, it's been the cooperative extensions. I think we need a broader model than that. Younger farmers, specifically, they're sharing information online as the cliche goes. National Young Farmers Coalition has a range of programs to share information through individualized regional chapters. And old-fashioned, the other side of that coin is that, you know, we can create every high-tech whiz-bang online profile possible, but probably where most of the information is exchanged is at these young farmer potlucks. Human beings are still social creatures, and we learn, I think, the most touching information when we're face-to-face to people.
Thanks a lot, Will. If you were able to communicate one thing to consumers, change one thing about consumer behavior, just in order to support some of this type of stuff, what would that be?
It immediately came to my mind in your talk where you compared the two apples. So I cannot tell you how frustrating it is. And there are actually some customers I see in the audience of my place which are exempted. I'm not including you in this group. But there are people that I know are good progressives, good environmentalists, and they come into my store, and if there is the slightest blemish on an apple or a tomato or a peach, they will not buy it. And I mean, it really comes to the heart of the section of your talk where if we want a particular outcome, then we need to adjust our expectation of where that outcome should be. So if we want more sustainable ecological farming, it's like the old Mitchell song, there's going to be spots on your apples. And it is incredibly frustrating to me as a practicing farmer in a retail environment to just see how resistant tomatoes, peaches, and apples are the worst. I don't know if it comes from like childhood cartoons or where do we get this image like of what a perfect tomato. You're going to chop a tomato up and make sauce out of it, for God's sakes, or put it on a sandwich. Why does it have to look perfect like some Disney, you know, cartoon image of a tomato? So if I could change one thing from the consumer's perspective, it would be amend your expectations of what food should look like. You are eating it. You can't see the nutrients inside it. You can't see all of the work that went into it. It's like my slide about visible and less visible effects. If all that you're responding to is how red and perfect it is, then boy, we have a big hurdle left to get over. So if you can figure out how to help me in that partnership, I want to collaborate and co-author that paper with you.
Be glad to. Try.
All right.